Dr. Shannon Sullivan. She's a clinical professor at Stanford University in the Department of Pediatrics, Pulmonary Asthma and Sleep Medicine, and by courtesy, the Department of Psychiatry and Division of Sleep Medicine. She's a renowned leader in sleep disorders in both pediatrics and adults. She chairs the American Academy of Sleep Medicine's Public Safety Committee, which in 2020, as you might well know, released a position statement in support of abolishing twice-yearly clock changes in favor of a year-round standard time. She also represents the National Sleep Foundation for the Consumer Technology Association's Task Force on Standards for Consumer Sleep Devices and Respiratory Monitoring Devices. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Shannon Sullivan.
Hi, I'm Shannon Sullivan. I'm a clinical professor at Stanford University and chair of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine Public Safety Committee. And today I'll be speaking on daylight saving time. Is it hazardous for your health? I have no relevant disclosures. And today we'll cover first a brief summary of daylight saving time in the United States, and then we'll review the American Academy of Sleep Medicine position on daylight saving time. We'll talk a lot about interactions between circadian biology and social and clock time, and what the acute and chronic impacts are of these interactions on health as well as safety. So first, a history. The first US law on daylight saving time was on March 19th, 1918. This was in the context of World War I. Outside of national defense, a number of advocates were identified, including the US Chamber of Commerce and sports lobbies, including golf, and of course, the national pastime baseball. There were opponents at that time, including the entertainment industry, in particular movies, as well as the farm lobby. And ultimately, that law ended with the end of World War I. The next time the US dabbled in daylight saving time was in 1942. Again, that was driven by World War II and energy savings, energy policy. Following that, urban areas such as New York City maintained daylight saving time, but rural areas did not, which led to some confusion. So that by 1966, the Uniform Time Act was passed, and this established 6 months of daylight saving time and 6 months of standard time. Now, states could either adopt this plan entirely or opt out. So for example, Arizona is a state that opted out. Then in 1973, in the context of the oil embargo, President Nixon enacted year-round daylight saving time. This was a very brief trial. It ended in part due to fears and concerns that school children would be hit by cars while waiting for the school bus in the dark. In 1986, we started our journey of DST creep. We had 7 months of DST, and then by 2005, 8 months of DST and only 4 months of standard time. Then earlier this year, on March 13th, the US Senate unanimously passed a bill labeled the Sunshine Protection Act. Section 260A of this bill authorizes states to observe daylight saving time year-round. And if enacted, this bill would take effect starting in November 2023. Now, it's currently stalled in the House. Well, what precipitated this? Generally speaking, the public does support and twice-yearly clock change. This is an example from a poll which asked this question: observing daylight saving time requires changing the clocks twice per year. Would you support the elimination of seasonal time changes in favor of a national fixed year-round time? And the answer to that is the majority of folks would say yes, they do support eliminating time change. That number is even higher if you look at parents with children. But in terms of which clock would people choose, there's not the same degree of alignment, so that some people would choose daylight saving time all year, others would choose daylight standard time, and some would actually continue to switch back and forth. Now, keep in mind that the last time, that 1974 trial of permanent daylight saving time, almost 80% of Americans supported it before it was enacted, and then support dropped dramatically within 3 months. And at the state level, there is quite a number of states that have adopted legislation should an opportunity be provided to be able to select which time to observe for that state, which clock time. So in this context, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and the Public Safety Committee, which I chair, put out this statement around daylight saving time. And this was in October 2020, about 2 years ago. There are two positions. The first is that the US should eliminate seasonal time changes in favor of a fixed year-round time. And the second position is that current evidence best supports the adoption of year-round standard time. Why? Because this best aligns with human circadian biology, and it also provides distinct benefits for public health and safety. And that's where I'd like to focus for the remainder of the talk. So first, let's examine that transition from standard time to daylight saving time in the spring. This, and a number of different epidemiological studies, has been shown to be acutely harmful. There's decrease in sleep duration and poorer quality. There's an increase in cardio and cerebrovascular morbidity, including 5% more heart attacks, 8% more strokes. From a safety perspective, fatal motor vehicle crashes increased by 6%. But I'll point out, and I'll show you this data in a moment, the west side of each time zone actually experiences the biggest increase in fatal motor vehicle crashes. In addition, there's increased emergency room visits, medical errors, increased medical missed appointments has been documented, as well as more stock market variability. And I have a lot of references there if you're interested in diving deeper into that. Now, here's some of that data on the fatal car accidents at the standard time to daylight saving time transition in the spring. And you'll see here, this is within a single time zone, that the largest effects are in those western regions of each time zone. And so that actually in the eastern region, the confidence interval is right up against 1. So I do want to point out here that the acute effects of the time change do not necessarily equate to chronic impacts. And so it's important for us to think about what's happening during that entire 8-month period of time of daylight saving time. And while in general we might agree on ending seasonal clock change, the options for ending it, has to be pointed out, are not equivalent. If you think about where the sun is in the sky in standard time versus daylight saving time, which is represented here at the meridian of each time zone, you can see this dotted line that's intended to be where the sun is highest within that time zone. And although the time zones don't line up perfectly in standard time, they don't experience that clock hour shift that you see in daylight saving time, which desynchronizes solar time from the clock time. So a little review on terminology. Circadian time is the timing of our human endogenous clocks. Solar time is the timing of natural light-dark cycle. So our exposure to sunlight and also to darkness. And this does vary depending on location within a time zone and time of year, but it can always be said that in daylight saving time, solar noon is always 1 clock hour later than in standard time, solar noon being when the sun is highest in the sky. Social time refers to the clock time of social and school commitments. So what time you have to be to work, what time you have to be to school. And it's important to note, and I'll repeat this theme, that circadian time follows the solar schedule. Sun is our Zeitgeber and not clock time or social time. And so that later light-dark signaling can lead to later biological preferenced timing. A couple of other terms to keep in mind. The first one is social jet lag. This refers to the difference in sleep timing on work or school days versus free days. So generally Monday through Friday versus weekends, although it varies for folks. And you can see here the distribution of social jet lag. That's hours on the y-axis and frequency in the population on the x-axis. The other term to keep in mind is chronotype. This is preference for morning versus evening, and this can be measured by midpoint of sleep on free days. So again, social jet lag, waking up earlier on weekdays than on weekends, and evening chronotype or night owlism is that preference for staying up later and sleeping in later, which teenagers often experience. So let's get back to brass tacks. Morning light is needed to align circadian rhythms to the 24-hour day. Now, 90% of humans have a clock length, which is internal clock length, which is greater than 24 hours or equal to 24 hours, and the median clock length is 24.18. Circadian time, that internal body clock, it follows sun or solar time, not social and clock time. There's actually very little evidence that circadian timing shifts fully during daylight saving time. Circadian clock actually tends to stay with the sun. And we know that from experiments, for example, on cortisol timing, that this shifts only by 2 minutes, not the full 60 minutes with DST change. And that's in the chronic state, not the necessarily acute effect. So that means that our body is in a constant tug of war during daylight saving time. We have the solar time and our circadian clock on one hand, and pulling against that is social and clock time on the other. What this means is that during daylight saving time, it's harder to sleep each evening. We have increased evening light exposure. There's a delay in the body's melatonin cycling. This can help to shift the biological clock to later, and that can also lead to staying awake later. DST also makes it a little harder to wake up each morning, and that's because DST shifts the social schedule earlier relative to our solar time, but it doesn't shift the body clock earlier relative to sun time. So we have to wake up in advance of our circadian rhythm and our cortisol rhythm. This increases alarm dependence and can be worse in the autumn, winter, and the early part of the spring, the shoulder seasons, when the solar day is shorter. And so here's a graphic that shows that. So we have solar noon here in standard time happening right at noon, and the body's natural wake time would be around 7:30 in the morning. Well, when we switch to daylight saving time, the body's natural wake time does not change, but now that's at 8:30. So we need to use an alarm clock to wake up at 7:30, and that first hour of the day we're spent feeling sleepy and not quite ready to start our day. So it can be said that for the same degree of misalignment during daylight saving time as during standard time, the alarm clock has to be 1 hour later during daylight saving time, which of course is not necessarily possible. This is also the reason that advocates of start school later reason that permanent daylight saving time actually works against biology and school start times. What's the empirical data for this? Daylight saving time has been shown to increase social jet lag, that difference between weekdays and weekends, quite a lot. So that during permanent daylight saving time, 6.7% more people will have social jet lag of greater than 1 hour, and 16.3% more individuals will have social jet lag of greater than or equal to 2 hours. Daylight saving time also reinforces evening types, and midpoint of sleep on free days has been shown to shift later. So if you take a look at what does that mean over that 8-month period of time for daylight saving time, actually this translates into 19 minutes per night less sleep throughout the daylight saving time period. And actually it's even worse for folks who start work before 7 a.m., like some members of this audience, where that number is 36 minutes per night less of sleep through the daylight saving time period. There are also studies that indicate increased sleep fragmentation, increased social jet lag, and reduced sleep quality as measured by the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. Now, small differences in total sleep duration reduction can make a difference. CDC has considered sleep deprivation an epidemic since 2014. We have a heat map there of the prevalence of folks who are sleeping a short amount of time, defined as 7 hours or less per night. There are a number of, again, epidemiological outcomes associated with short sleep time or insufficient sleep. I do want to point out, though, that permanent daylight saving time may disproportionately affect the health of children, adolescents, and adults with eveningness chronotype. And also, again, depend on exactly where you live. I love this map. This is from the Washington Post. This was published this spring after the Senate bill was passed. And this is a map of the time of the latest sunrise in the year if daylight saving time is made permanent. And you can see it really does depend on where you live. So there are large portions of the country that would not experience sunrise on the shortest day of the year, on their latest sunrise until between 9 and 9:30, and even 9:30 to 10 o'clock. Even in other areas, sunrise would be happening between 8 and 8:30. And again, this is oftentimes after our morning school and work commute. The other thing to consider is age. 10 to 17-year-olds are considered to be the most sensitive to permanent daylight saving time, in the sense that they are very sensitive to the dissociation between solar and social time, and they have been demonstrated to have persistent increased social jet lag during permanent daylight saving time. I'll show you that data a little bit later. And of course, there are other environmental influences such as electrical light that can impact this. So let's take a look at the data for performance. This is a really interesting study now, published back in 2010 out of the state of Indiana. Indiana is considered a quasi-natural laboratory, and that's because a large part of that state has year-round standard time. So the way this works is that the red areas are in central time, but do observe daylight saving time. The yellow areas there observe year-round Eastern Standard Time, so they don't switch. And then the green areas are in the Eastern time zone, but they do observe the twice yearly switch to daylight saving time. And these researchers found that there were SAT score differences related to what your solar exposure was relative to clock time, that best aligned with folks who had year-round standard time versus the twice yearly switch to daylight saving time. And this is after controlling for socioeconomic status, which they did by controlling for school lunch program. And these authors concluded that the condition of being out of phase with natural solar time and accompanying biorhythms for several months out of the year over one's lifetime may have contributed to these scholastic differences. Now, this was after controlling for the time of year that the SAT was taken. Here's some naturalistic data from India, which shows that locations with later average sunsets are associated with worse educational outcomes among young children aged 6 to 16. And they concluded that a 1 hour delay in sunset delayed bedtime by about a third of an hour, but without a wake time compensation. And this was associated with a years of education reduction of almost 1 year. In addition, later sunsets were associated with lower likelihood to complete primary middle school, less likely to be enrolled in school, and lower test scores. And you can see this almost linear relationship. Here's a study out of Norway showing something similar. Again, this is in young folks, 16 to 19-year-olds. And you can see that, yes, while total sleep duration does have an impact or associations with grade point average, take a look at this bedtime difference weekdays to weekends. This is our social jet lag. And you can see that the larger the social jet lag, the lower the grade point average. Here's another interesting study. This is from 2017, again, focusing on social jet lag and showing that shorter sleep weekday time in bed and later weekend sleep was associated with smaller gray matter volumes in the frontal anterior cingulate and precuneal cortices. Let's focus a little bit on health. This is a really interesting study out of Russia, which showed that a chronic 1-hour forward transition of the social clock is associated with increased social jet lag and increased seasonal mood disorder. So this is a study of 10 to 24-year-olds in the European north of Russia. There were almost 8,000 individuals studied. And what's interesting about this area is that this area before 2011 experienced seasonal daylight saving time, so twice yearly clock shifts. And then between 2011 and 2014, they went to permanent daylight saving time. And then following fall 2014, they went to permanent standard time. And what these researchers showed is that the condition of permanent daylight saving time was associated with the highest prevalence of seasonal affective disorder in the winter among these adolescents. And it was even worse than in folks who had the twice yearly clock change for daylight saving time. Standard time had the lowest rates. Let's take a look at fitness and weight. Now, the assertion here is that increased evening light will predispose to increased physical activity, but actually in winter under permanent daylight saving time in many locations in the United States, it's not clear that this is true because it will still get dark very early since these are our shortest solar days in the middle of winter. We also have to think about school schedule adaptation and whether or not adaptations will be made that will basically burn through any additional light we have in the evening. And then finally, there are significant weather limitations in places like where I hail from in the northern Midwest. The other argument against this is that perhaps social jet lag and related shorter sleep duration may negate any positive influence of exercise. So let's take a look at the data. First is a study by Kathleen Zick. This was among adults in Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah from 2003 to 2009. And what they did in this study is that the hours of sunlight and average high temperature for the diary month were held constant, so that the primary effect that they studied is the timing of sunrise and sunset. And what they found is that shifting 1 hour of daylight from the morning to the evening had no impact on the exercise amount of American adults living in the Southwest. Here's some aggregated data among children. This is over 23,000 children, data from over 23,000 children from 15 different studies in 9 different countries. And you can see that when with a later sunset, there is more activity in the evening hours, and that's true on school days as well as on weekends and holidays, but actually not in the United States. In the United States, there was no impact. Let's take a look at physical health associations with social jet lag. Now, this is really interesting. In this group of 14 to 17-year-olds, greater social jet lag was actually associated with higher BMI scores and higher waist to height ratios, even though physical activity was no different between the social jet lag and non-social jet lag groups. Similarly, in this Danish study, this was 676 children, a little bit younger, aged 8 to 11, and measured a number of different ways, including actigraphy, sleep habits, ghrelin and leptin measures, and diet logs. This group showed that short sleep duration and higher sleep variability was associated with a poor and obesity-promoting diet. And in fact, there are physical activity differences. You can see over here on the right side that between the social jet lag group and the non-social jet lag group in this particular study, and there's an increased odds of obesity, and that's really important to keep in mind. So children who have social jet lag are more likely to be overweight. They're more likely to be obese. They're less likely to get the same degree of physical activity. And among these studies, this observation that a 1 hour difference in social jet lag is associated with a 30% higher overweight and obesity prevalence, which you can see here in this heat map, has been demonstrated, and that the largest effect are those with early work or school schedules. Finally, here's a study looking at cardiorespiratory fitness. Now, this was there was an effect shown in boys, but not girls, even after adjustment for sleep duration, sleep quality, and confounders. In this cross-sectional sample of just under 300 adolescents, VO2 max was shown to be decreased with increasing social jet lag. Other data from the social jet lag research is out of scope to summarize all of this, but from the social jet lag literature itself, there's increased likelihood to smoke, consume caffeine and alcohol, higher incidence of depression, anxiety disorders, metabolic disorders, depression, cardiovascular problems, and decreased life expectancy, as well as worse cognitive performance and academic achievement. So a lot there, and none of it pointing to better health outcomes. So let's pivot a little bit and look at data from position within a single time zone. The reason this is useful is because you can exactly look at the exposure of solar timing relative to the clock time within a single time zone. Eastern time is a really good area to take a look at this. You can see that there's a whole hour of sunset time difference from the eastern edge to the western edge of this time zone. So these studies take advantage of the fact that there's a 1 hour sun time difference on the same clock time. And you compare those western and eastern boundaries within the time zone. And this is just to remind us that even small changes in sun time can affect sleep schedules. So this is looking at that midpoint of sleep on free days. And this demonstrates that about a 1 degree change in longitude equals about 4 minutes of sun time change, and that midpoint of sleep moves with even small changes in sun time. So here's some data looking at causal estimates of the health effects of misalignment using this types of naturalistic data that we can get. And again, the idea here is that the western edge of the time zone is the late sunset side, and this can lead to later bedtimes for a variety of reasons, including entertainment reasons, and that people in the western part of a time zone will have more malalignment of solar timing with clock time. So this is from the economics literature of all things. And I love this quote that sleep is a commodity we all demand. So we don't often think about sleep as a commodity, but economic researchers do. And in their analyses, 1 hour of sun misalignment is associated not just with overall cancer risk, I'll show you some data on that in a second, but also a 10 to 30% increase in obesity, a 19% increase in heart attacks, increase in coronary and anginal diseases, as well as diabetes and breast cancer. And these researchers concluded, again, this is from the Journal of Health Economics, that the unnatural timing of sleep may be the most prevalent high-risk behavior in modern society. So here's some of that data on cancer risk. This is aggregated data from the US SEER program from 2000 to 2012. And essentially, to kind of summarize it, the risk of all cancer per 5 degree longitudinal movement west is increased for both men and women. And you can see it depends on the type of cancer. What's really interesting in another recent study has been shown that liver cancer increases by about 21% for every hour of misalignment from the center of the time zone, for example. It's not just cancer impacts. There are also significant economic impacts from circadian misalignment, this kind of chronic circadian misalignment brought on by DST. Back of the envelope healthcare costs and productivity losses are associated with the discontinuity in sunlight onset occurring at the border of the time zone. And this amounts to about $2 billion in increased healthcare costs, about 4.4 million days of work lost. And this is in contrast to studies that have shown that 1 hour more of nightly sleep can increase productivity by more than a year of added education and increase earnings by more than 6 months of added education. So there is an equity argument to be made for the timing of the sun versus our clock time. Now I want to pivot a little bit and talk about safety. It is the case that daylight saving time will darken mornings. Keep in mind that the average US school start time is 8 a.m. and the median US work arrival time is 7:55 a.m. And take a look at these graphics that show you what that means in terms of a pragmatic difference. So here's some data on traffic fatalities, comparing fatal motor vehicle accidents in the United States in places that were more aligned with the sun versus areas that were delayed by at least 30 minutes. The delayed versus aligned time zone regions had 21.8% more fatal motor vehicle crashes, and that amounts to over 1,200 excess deaths per year. Finally, a couple of myths. So the first myth, and I just heard my son tell me this this week, is that daylight saving time is summertime. He's not looking forward to the fallback clock change that we'll be experiencing in a couple of weeks. And that's because for him and for many of us, daylight saving time equates to sunny days, warmer temperatures, and longer days. But these are not due to daylight saving time. In fact, daylight saving time does not change daylight length. That changes with the season. And during daylight saving time, people simply go to work an hour earlier relative to sunrise and come home an hour earlier relative to sunset. Another one is that changing from standard time to daylight saving time is just like flying to a new time zone, and this is not really true. And that's because when we go to standard time to daylight saving time, the clocks change, but nothing else does, including our exposure to solar light and dark. And so our bodies follow the sun, and therefore we don't adjust. We just sleep a little bit less. That's really different from flying to a different time zone where the clocks change, but so does our environment and our exposure to the light-dark cycle. So in conclusion, daylight saving time is simply in advance of the social clock. We agree to do everything 1 hour earlier relative to solar time. And permanent daylight saving time and more evening daylight do tend to lead to circadian misalignment, to shorter sleep, and to increased social jet lag. And this can have a variety of negative health and safety impacts, including cancer, mood disorders, metabolic disorders, safety, fitness, educational attainment, and perhaps some macroeconomic health consequences. So finally, in conclusion, we're going to go back to a cartoon from 100 years ago. Don't mess with time, or time will mess with you. And finally, thank you so much. And here's the information on how to claim your CME. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Sullivan. That was a really illuminating talk. Haha, pun intended. I just just a few questions here. Dr. Oakley is also joining us. So what are the common, I mean, you've provided so much evidence in support of standard time. So what are the common barriers to getting this legislation across?
That's a great question. I think, you know, one of the issues in this space, in the public policy space, is the number of different stakeholders involved. So, you know, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, Sleep Research Society, we tend to approach this from sort of the biological point of view and circadian point of view. But if you are coming at it from the entertainment industry, you might have a different perspective. The sports industry, I think in particular, and it's an interest of mine because I see children, but you know, a lot of the time the narrative I hear is like, but my kids really need that time after school for sports. It's such an important part of life. And of course, we very much promote physical activity among children. And so trying to untangle sort of time of year and weather from clock policy is difficult because, of course, clock policy standard time happens during our shortest days of the year. So we tend to equate these things together. And this, by the way, just as a like a reflection, I think this, you know, the perspective of having economic points of view on this and business points of view on this and energy points of view on this, this has been the case ever since daylight saving time policy was first introduced into the United States over 100 years ago.
Right, yeah.
Where do you see the future of this going? I know the legislation is stalled right now in Congress. Is this going to die or something that can be brought back up? I know the American Academy of Sleep Medicine is obviously lobbying very heavy for the opposite change.
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I had a crystal ball and knew. I think, you know, what's interesting. So on the one hand, if you look at that heat map, if like early on in this slide presentation, I showed this map that shows like what are folks thinking at the state level? What are state legislatively? What are states doing? And I think a number of states are leaning towards, if they were given the opportunity under federal law to be able to make a decision, that a few more states would go toward daylight saving time than not. But what's interesting is, you're right, Dennis, the Senate bill, which was passed unanimously, has stalled out in the House. We've been following the kind of coverage of that. It's a little nebulous as to the exact reasons. I just don't think there's the same degree of support. And the American Academy of Sleep Medicine has called for more science, more hearings. They requested that the Department of Transportation provide more evidence to the Committee on Commerce to try to understand this better. So, you know, I think my own personal prediction is that maybe we won't see this get signed into law this particular session. I don't know if that's the case, but I do think that, no pun intended, Christine, more light of day needs to be shown on where we are in terms of the science. And, you know, it was a 25-minute talk. We have imperfect data. And it's really important to acknowledge that and to highlight that. There's something also from 2020 from SRS, which is sort of a public education series that highlights some of the things we don't know. And I think it's really important to examine our own assumptions around clock policy in this space as well. But it's always difficult when policy, it's now or never. The bill is passed now. What's going to happen right now, even though we have imperfect data and imperfect evidence? So how does one move forward? You do the best you can with the information and data that you have.
And not to bring politics back into it, but the nightmare scenario could be where states are allowed to decide their own. And you could have this total patchwork of time zones across the country. You don't see that happening, do you?
I don't. I mean, that was sort of the experience in the post-World War II era. Early on, both for World War I and World War II, these national clock policies were made to save energy during wartime. And following World War II, some urban areas continued with the daylight saving time clock, and generally rural areas did not. Farmers would prefer more morning light. The farm lobby, at least at that time, was very much in favor of that. So it was exactly what you say. There was a great public outcry about that because of train schedules and travel schedules and, people missing business deals. In the interest of time, I cut out a really great quote from Time magazine with a reader from Ohio who wrote a poem exactly about sort of lost economic opportunity related to misaligned clocks between locations. So I don't think we'll go back to that, but of course, Arizona's in that state. When the Uniform Time Act was passed, they opted out entirely. So there are some areas, and Hawaii is another example. There are places that do not change the clocks right now.
It's so interesting to me how this affects all facets of life, not just health, but economics, like you said, safety. Are you aware of any data on crime? Because I know in our area there's some push in that regard, using statistics in crime and how this might affect crime rates to support the legislation.
Yeah, that's a great question, Christine. And there is some data out there, like in a lot of these areas, it's a little bit incomplete and focuses more on the acute change rather than on the chronic change. And so to channel Karen Johnson, one of our wonderful colleagues in neurology, she's spoken very persuasively around this, that people often quote crime data as being a reason to favor daylight saving time. There's more light at the end of the day. But actually, when you look at the underlying studies or underpinning studies, these are very short-term studies that basically look at the week after the time change or clock change, and not necessarily the entire period of time. And with the limited data that we have, published data where this has actually been evaluated, the crime statistics do not necessarily bear out.
Great. And just one final thing, where can our viewers go if they want to learn more about this or participate in advocacy?
Yeah, thanks so much. So, I put the link for the AASM position statement on the chat, and thank you so much for adding that to the Whova. But it's really quite easy. You can just Google AASM daylight saving time, and one of the first links that come up is a position statement. I think that's a great starting place. There are a number of links. If you click on one of the AASM website links, you'll see a number of links to other research as well. And then I also think that the SRS has done a very good job of sort of aggregating some of the arguments on both sides of the fence from a biological perspective, and also highlighting what we know, but also what we don't know, which I think it's important to keep in mind as we approach this issue.
Great. Thank you so much, Shannon.